The Iron Concordat of Veth Malun was not a government in the way softer worlds understood the word, but a logistics engine wearing the costume of a throne, a machinery of supply lines and conscription quotas, and fear that had been refined across 11 centuries into something that no longer required a tyrant to operate it, because the system itself had become the tyrant, indifferent and self-perpetuating, and entirely confident that nothing arriving from outside its borders could be anything other than fuel. The fortress city of Drenek Sept sat at the convergence of 9 orbital tethers, its black basalt ramparts grown rather than built, cultivated over centuries from a living mineral lattice that thickened wherever pressure was applied, so that every siege in its history had only made it stronger, every assault feeding the walls the stress they craved. Inside those walls, the Maluni kept their accounts, and high among those accounts, filed under the cold designation of strategic asset rather than person, was the hostage. The system did not see her as a woman. The system saw a line item, a guarantee of good behavior extracted from a defeated neighboring polity, a body to be kept alive and intact precisely as long as her continued existence prevented her homeworld from doing anything inconvenient. She had been delivered to Drenek Sept in a sealed transport with her wrists bound in resonance cuffs, and the officers who received her had logged her arrival with the same effectless precision they used to log a shipment of reactor coolant. Nobody on Veth Malun expected the hostage to matter. That was the first error, and it was an error of the system itself, not of any single mind within it, because the system had been built by predators who had never once in 11 centuries been forced to imagine that their prey might be carrying a sharper instrument than a blade. Her name was Sarai Voss, and she was 34 years old, and she had spent the first 19 of those years inside the failing supply corps of a world that lost wars, not because its soldiers lacked courage, but because its logistics were a catastrophe, a tangle of redundant requisitions and ghost inventories and depots that starved, while warehouses 300 kilometers away rotted under the weight of surplus nobody had thought to move. She had not been a princess in any sense the Maluni would have recognized. She had been the youngest daughter of a deposed quartermaster general, raised in the cargo holds and rail yards of a defeated state, and her education had consisted almost entirely of watching good people die because the food and the ammunition and the medicine had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Maluni did not know any of this. They had her file, and her file said royal, because the treaty that produced her had used the word, and the Maluni respected paperwork above all things. They did not read the second page. There was always a second page, and the Iron Concordat never read it, because the system had decided long ago that the contents of a hostage were irrelevant to the function of a hostage. This was the second error. The officer who held formal custody of her was Warden Prefect Kalath Fren, and he was, by any measure the Concordat used to evaluate its own, a model administrator. He was tall in the manner of his species, his frame a column of dense interlocking plating beneath a uniform the color of cooled iron, his eyes the flat amber of a creature that had never needed to ask permission for anything. He spoke in the clipped cadence of a man reading from a ledger, and he had built his entire career on the principle that fear, properly metered and consistently applied, was cheaper and more reliable than loyalty. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He had a hidden ledger of his own, and that ledger was the thing that would eventually destroy him. Though on the day Sarai Voss arrived, he believed himself perfectly safe. because the system had never once held him accountable for anything. What Kalath Vren had done, quietly across the preceding 4 years, was sell the Concordate's surplus. Not weapons, nothing so crude as to trigger an audit. He had sold the surplus that the system did not know it had. The overstock that accumulated in a logistics engine too vast and too poorly tracked to count its own holdings. And he had pocketed the proceeds through a chain of shell requisitions that depended entirely on one fragile condition. The condition was that nobody competent ever looked closely at the books. For 11 centuries, nobody competent ever had. She was given quarters in the administrative tier, a narrow cell with a transparent inner wall, the better to observe her, and for the first 3 days she did nothing the Malauni found notable. She sat. She watched. She asked, in the trade creole that served as the lingua franca of the border worlds, for access to a data slate, and the request was granted because denying a hostage reading material was the kind of petty cruelty the Concorda considered beneath its dignity, the system preferring its cruelties large and systemic rather than small and personal. They gave her the slate loaded with public administrative records, the dull, public-facing inventory of a fortress city, the sort of thing no hostage had ever once asked to read. The junior officer who provisioned the slate noted the request in his log and thought nothing of it. He would think a great deal about it later. What Sarai Voss saw when she opened those public records was not boredom. She saw a wound. She saw the same disease that had killed her world, the same tangle of redundant requisitions and ghost inventories in depots that starved beside overflowing warehouses, except that here, on Veth Maloon, the disease had metastasized across a logistics engine 1,000 times larger than the one that had failed her homeworld, and nobody inside the system could see it, because to the Malauni, the inefficiency was simply the weather, the background condition of existence, the way things had always been, and therefore the way things must necessarily be. She read for 9 hours without stopping. She read the public manifests and the tether traffic schedules and the conscription supply tables, and somewhere in the 7th hour, she found the first anomaly. A depot in the southern tether yard that was receiving 4 times the coolant it could possibly consume, the surplus simply vanishing from the public record with no corresponding consumption entry. She did not know yet what it meant. She knew only that it was wrong, the single wrong pixel in an enormous tactical image, and she had spent her entire life training her eye to find exactly that. The squad assigned to guard the administrative tier had been told that the hostage was a formality, and they resented the assignment accordingly. They were not common soldiers. They were a Talon cadre, the elite enforcement unit of Drennek Sept, 6 specialists drawn from across the Concordate's conquered territories and welded into a single instrument of compliance. And being posted to babysit a line item was, to them, an insult, dressed as a duty. Their cadre leader was Submarshal Othenex Bree, whose left eye had been replaced with a kinetic auger lens that read motion as mathematics, every twitch and shift of a body resolving for her into vectors and probabilities, and who had concluded within 4 seconds of meeting Sarai Voss that the human represented a threat coefficient of essentially 0. Bree was rarely wrong about such things. The auger did not lie. The auger measured muscle and reach and the microtremor of fear, and the human's body told the auger nothing alarming at all. The auger could not measure what was happening behind the human's eyes, because no instrument the Concordate had ever built was designed to measure that. And this gap, this single unmeasured dimension, was the third error, and it was the one that would cost them everything. The second member of the cadre was Dral Korin, a tracker whose people had evolved in the deep tectonic galleries of a high-gravity world, his sensory apparatus tuned to vibration and pressure, capable of reading the footsteps of a creature 3 floors below through the resonance in the basalt. He found the human stillness unsettling in a way he could not articulate. Most prisoners vibrated. They trembled. They paced. Their hearts hammered against their ribs in a rhythm Dral could feel through the floor. The human's rhythm was slow and even and entirely unbothered, and Dral had encountered that particular signature only twice before in his life, both times in creatures that turned out to be far more dangerous than they appeared. He did not report this. There was no field on the standard observation form for the heart rate is wrong because it is too calm. The form did not imagine such a thing was possible. The third was Yisin Vial, the cadre's infiltration specialist, a slight figure whose species could flatten their chromatophores to near invisibility against any surface and who had not spoken more than 40 words in the 8 years Bree had commanded the unit. Yisin watched. That was what Yisin did. Yisin had watched a great many prisoners and had developed across those years a taxonomy of the captive mind, the 4 or 5 distinct ways a caged creature responded to its cage, and within the first day, Yisin understood that the human fit none of the categories. The human was not despairing. The human was not plotting escape. The human was working methodically and without urgency on a problem the rest of them could not see. And Yisin, who trusted observation above all things, began to watch the human more closely than Yisin had watched anyone in years. The remaining 3 filled out the cadre's tactical spine. There was Mautha Gren, the demolitions and structural specialist whose pride in his own technical precision was the load-bearing pillar of his entire identity, and who would come to resent the human for reasons he could not admit, even to himself. There was the cadre's medic, Isabel Thorne, a healer whose dual nature combined surgical delicacy with the raw physical strength her species used to set bone, and who occupied the narrow ground between the soldiers and the things they guarded. And there was the youngest, a recruit named Korin Daff, eager and rigid and desperate to prove himself, who believed every word the Concordat had ever told him, and who would be, in the end, the first to break ranks, though not in the direction anyone expected. Together, they were a closed circuit, a self-sufficient mechanism of violence and discipline, and they regarded the human in their charge with the unified contempt of professionals assigned to guard a piece of furniture. On the 4th day, Sarai Voss asked to speak to a logistics officer. The request traveled up the chain and was denied, then denied again. Then, on the 6th ascent, reached the desk of a mid-tier supply administrator who was bored enough and curious enough to grant it, partly because no hostage had ever made such a request, and partly because he assumed it would produce an amusing anecdote for the officer's mess. He arrived at her cell expecting to be entertained. What he received instead was a sequence of questions so precise and so quietly devastating that he left 40 minutes later, white around the gills and clutching the data slate he had brought to humor her. She had asked him to explain the coolant discrepancy in the southern tether yard. He could not. She had asked him why the conscription supply tables showed rations for a garrison of 80,000 when the public census listed 62,000 personnel. He could not answer that either. She had asked, finally, in the same mild tone she had used throughout, whether anyone in the entire fortress city had ever once reconciled the public manifests against the actual physical holdings, and the administrator had realized, with a slow, cold horror, that the answer was no, that nobody ever had, that the entire logistics engine of Drennick Sept ran on the assumption that the numbers in the system bore some relationship to reality, when in fact, nobody had checked in living memory. He reported the conversation to his superior. His superior reported it upward. And somewhere in that ascent, the report passed across the desk of Warden Prefect Calath Vren, who read it and went very still. Eason Vile was the one who noticed Vren's stillness. Eason had been delivering a routine perimeter report when the administrator's memo reached the Warden Prefect, and Eason, who watched everything, saw the Warden Prefect's plating tighten by a fraction of a degree, saw the amber eyes hold on a single line of text for 3 seconds longer than reading required, saw the careful, deliberate way Vren set the slate down and folded his hands. Eason did not know what it meant. Eason filed it away. The infiltration specialist had survived 8 years in the most dangerous unit in the Concordat by understanding that the things people tried hardest to make invisible were precisely the things worth seeing, and Calath Vren had just tried very hard to make a reaction invisible. Action. That was the moment the cadre's involvement in the humans' story stopped being an insult and became, though none of them knew it yet, the most consequential assignment of their lives. Vren did the rational thing, which was to make the problem disappear. He could not have the hostage killed outright, because her death would void the treaty and bring her homeworld's reprisal down on the Concordat, and more to the point, her death would trigger exactly the kind of formal inquiry that might cause someone to open the books. So, he did something cleverer. He reclassified her. With a few keystrokes, the Warden Prefect transferred Sarai Voss from the Protected Asset Register to the Labor Rotation Pool, on the documented grounds that an idle hostage was a waste of resources, and that productive labor would improve her conditioning. The reclassification was perfectly legal. It was also, Vren knew, very likely lethal, because the labor he assigned her to was the Tether Yard Maintenance Rotation, the most dangerous non-combat posting in Drenek Sept, where the orbital cables that held the city to its 9 anchor points were serviced under conditions that killed an average of 1 worker every 9 days. If the human died in an industrial accident, no treaty was voided, no inquiry was triggered, and the books stayed closed. He assigned the Talon cadre to escort her, framing it as a security measure. It was, in fact, a witness control measure. He wanted the cadre present so that if anything unfortunate happened, there would be 6 disciplined professionals to confirm it had been an accident. He did not consider that the cadre might, given enough time, begin to think for themselves. That was the 4th error, and it was the last one the system would be permitted. The Tether Yard was a cathedral of structural violence, a vertical shaft 300 meters across descending into the planet's mantle heat, the 9 great cables rising through it like the strings of an instrument tuned to a frequency that could shear a body in half. The work was brutal and constant. The cables required continuous adjustment as thermal expansion and orbital drift shifted their load, and the adjustment was performed by hand, by workers in pressure rigs clinging to the cable housings while the basalt around them groaned under stress. Sarai Voss arrived at the yard on the 7th day of her captivity, and within 20 minutes of observing the operation, she understood 3 things that the yard's own foreman had never understood. She understood that the cables were being adjusted reactively rather than predictively, the crews responding to drift after it occurred rather than anticipating it, which meant every adjustment was an emergency, and every emergency was a death risk. She understood that the thermal expansion data the crews needed was being collected by sensors that reported to a central station that no crew chief could access in real time, so that the people doing the dying had no access to the information that would let them stop dying. And she understood that the entire deadly rhythm of the yard, the one death every 9 days metronome, was not a law of nature, but a failure of information flow. The exact same failure that had killed her world, manifesting here as crushed workers instead of starved soldiers. She did not announce any of this. She picked up a rig and went to work. The Talon cadre watched from the observation gantry, and Submarshal Breeze Auger tracked the human's movements and reported, with mechanical confidence, that the human's body was performing the labor adequately and presented no anomaly. The auger could not see that the human was not merely working the cable but reading it, learning the rhythm of the drift, building in her head the predictive model that the yard had never possessed. Dral Corin, 3 gantries up, felt the human's heart rate through the basalt and found it, again, impossibly calm, the heartbeat of someone solving a puzzle rather than fearing for their life. On the second day in the yard, a junior worker named Tessil, a conscript from a conquered moon, lost her footing on a housing during an unannounced thermal surge and would have fallen the 300 meters into the mantle heat had Sarai Voss not already been watching the drift indicators and already been moving, not toward Tessil, but toward the manual override on the housing clamp, which she engaged a full 1.5 seconds before the surge peaked, locking the housing and giving Tessil the half instant she needed to recover her grip. Sarai Voss did not look at the worker she had saved. She returned to her own cable and resumed her work as though nothing had occurred, as though preventing a death were simply a thing one did, an undeniable law of physics rather than an act of heroism. For 3 excruciating seconds, absolute silence reigned across the gantry. Mao the Gren, the demolition specialist, was the one who broke it, and he broke it with contempt, because the human had just done something his own training said was impossible, had read a thermal surge 1.5 seconds before the yard's own instruments registered it, and the only way Gren could metabolize that was to insist it had been luck. He said as much, loudly, to the cadre. Nobody answered him. Isenvale was watching the human's hands. Dral Korun was watching the data the human had apparently read off the cable itself. And Submarshal Bree, whose auger had logged the human's movement and timestamped the override, was performing the arithmetic and arriving, slowly and against her own will, at a conclusion the auger could not have reached on its own. The human had not reacted to the surge. The human had predicted it. And prediction, in a creature the Concordat had filed as a threat coefficient of 0, was not a thing the auger knew how to classify. That night, Sarai Voss asked Isabel Thorne, the medic, for access to the yard's sensor logs. She asked plainly, without preamble, explaining that she wanted to understand the drift pattern. Thorne, whose dual nature made her the cadre member most accustomed to standing between violence and the bodies it produced, found herself granting the request before she had decided to, partly out of curiosity and partly because there was something in the human's manner that made refusal feel petty. The logs were not classified. They were simply ignored. Thorne brought them and watched as the human spread them across the data slate and began in the trade creole to explain what she saw, not lecturing, not performing, simply describing the wound the way a person describes weather. The drift was periodic. The thermal surges followed the orbital cycle of the inner moon with a lag of 40 minutes. The yard could predict every dangerous surge 40 minutes in advance, had always been able to, and had instead chosen, through no decision anyone had ever consciously made, to respond to each surge as an emergency and bury a worker every 9 days. Thorne listened, and somewhere in the listening she stopped thinking of the human as a hostage and started thinking of her as something else, something for which the Concordat's vocabulary had no word. By the end of the first week, the human had restructured the tether yard. She had done it without authority, without permission, without ever once raising her voice, simply by doing the work and explaining the pattern to anyone who would listen. And the pattern was so obviously correct, so undeniable once seen, that the crews began to adopt it on their own. They posted a drift watcher on the central sensor station and ran the 40-minute lag as a countdown, calling the surges before they came. And within 5 days, the yard had gone from 1 death every 9 days to no deaths at all, a transformation so total and so quiet that the Fortress City's administration did not even notice it had occurred, because the system only tracked deaths, and the absence of deaths registered as nothing at all. But the cadre noticed. The cadre who had been posted to the yard to witness the human's accident had instead witnessed the human prevent everyone else's, and the contempt with which they had arrived had curdled into something none of them would name: a wary, reluctant recalibration of everything they thought they knew about the soft pink creature they had been assigned to guard. It was Corin Daff, the youngest, who first crossed the line, though he did not understand at the time that he was crossing anything. His pressure rig had developed a fault in the seal, a slow leak that the cadre's own equipment master had failed to catch, and which would have killed him on his next descent into the yard's lower pressures. Sarai Voss noticed it the way she noticed everything: the single wrong detail in the frame, the faint irregularity in the way the rig held its shape, and she fixed it without being asked, working the seal with a tool she had fabricated from a discarded clamp, performing the repair in the maintenance bay while Karan slept, asking nothing, saying nothing. Karan discovered the repair the next morning and did not understand it. He took the rig to the equipment master, who confirmed the seal had been failing and was now sound, and who could not explain who had fixed it or how. Corin knew. Corin had seen the human in the maintenance bay, and Corin, who believed every word the Concordat had ever told him about the inferiority of conquered species and the disposability of hostages, found that he could not reconcile those words with the fact that the disposable hostage had quietly saved his life and then declined to mention it. The contradiction lodged in him like a splinter, and it did not work its way out. It worked its way in. The shared object that finally cracked the cadre's circuit was a thermal flask. The yard's lower galleries were brutally cold, the mantle heat notwithstanding, the pressure differential zones stripping warmth from anything that lingered, and the crews had always simply endured it, because requesting better gear meant filing a requisition that the system would ignore. Sarai Voss, on her own initiative, repaired a derelict heat exchange unit that had sat broken in the maintenance bay for years, and used it to warm a flask of the bitter root tea the conquered conscripts drank, and she left the flask in the gallery where the crews rested. She did not offer it to anyone. She simply made warmth available, the way she made everything available, and walked away. The flask circulated. The conscripts drank from it, and then, on the third day, Drow Corin, the tracker who could feel a heartbeat through stone, and who had been the most physically resistant to the human's presence, picked up the flask during a rest cycle and drank from it. And the moment he did, the entire cadre understood that something had changed, though none of them said so, because saying so was not how their kind acknowledged anything. The flask passed from hand to hand. The warmth passed with it, and the human who had made the warmth said nothing, asked nothing, and returned to her work. While the cadre thawed, Warden Prefect Kaloth-Vren grew colder. The human had not died in the yard. Worse, the human had made the yard safe, and a safe yard was a yard that produced surplus labor, and surplus capacity, and surplus was precisely the thing Vren's hidden ledger depended on nobody examining too closely. The humans' restructuring had begun, without anyone intending it, to generate exactly the kind of reconciled, accurate numbers that would eventually expose the 4 years of theft buried in the Fortress City's books. Vren understood that the human was not merely an inconvenience now. The human was an existential threat, a creature whose entire nature was to find the wrong pixel in the system, and his theft was the largest wrong pixel of all. He decided she had to die, and this time he decided it had to look like the yard itself had killed her, an industrial accident witnessed and certified by his own enforcement cadre. He summoned Sub-Marshal Bree and gave the order obliquely, in the language of administration, instructing her that during the next major thermal event, the human was to be assigned to the deep gallery, alone, beyond the range of the override clamps, where a surge would do the work no executioner could be ordered to do. Bree listened and said nothing, and saluted, and left. The auger in her left eye had spent a week recalibrating its model of the human, and the model it had now built did not match the order she had just been given. But an order was an order, and the cadre did not disobey. The major thermal event arrived on the orbital cycle exactly when the human's own predictive model said it would, a convergence surge, the inner moon and the outer drift, aligning to produce a thermal load 3 times any ordinary surge, the kind of event the yard had historically survived only by evacuating entirely. Viren timed his order to it. Bree, following the order, assigned Saraivos to the deep gallery. And Saraivos, who had read the drift tables and knew exactly what was coming, understood as she descended that she was being killed. She did not protest. She did not run. She went down into the deep gallery with her tools because she had spent her entire life understanding that the only way out of a logistics failure was through the logistics, and she had already, in the 4 days since she first read the convergence surge data, worked out what the yard had never worked out, which was that the deep gallery's pressure relief system had been installed backward. This was the seed planted in the 7th hour of her first day, the coolant discrepancy in the southern tether yard finally bearing its fruit. The surplus coolant Vren had been selling had never been surplus at all. It had been the coolant the deep gallery's relief system required to vent a convergence surge safely, and Vren, in stripping it out to sell, had quietly converted the deep gallery from the safest part of the yard into a sealed bomb that nobody knew was armed, because nobody competent had ever read the books. The convergence surge that Vren intended to kill one hostage was, in fact, going to rupture the deep gallery's relief manifold and send a thermal cascade up all 9 cables. And the cascade would not stop at the deep gallery. It would climb. It would reach the observation gantry where the Talon cadre stood watching, and it would kill all 6 of them. And then it would reach the administrative tier, and it would not be a tragedy the system could absorb, because it would be the kind of catastrophe that triggered exactly the formal inquiry Vren had spent 4 years avoiding. The warden prefect, in trying to bury his theft beneath one more body, had armed a weapon that would expose everything. Saraivos had perhaps 11 minutes. She spent the first 2 confirming what she already suspected, tracing the relief manifold by hand in the dark of the deep gallery, finding the venting ports that should have been cool, and feeling them already warming, the convergence surge building in the cables overhead like a held breath. She did not have the coolant. There was no time to source it and nowhere to source it from. What she had was the thing she had always had, the knowledge of a person who grew up making broken things work because there had never been money to replace them, and she knew that a relief system designed to vent thermal load could be made to vent it through a different path if the path were opened fast enough and in the right sequence. She worked in the dark with the tools she had fabricated and the discarded clamp tool she carried everywhere, and she rerouted the manifold not by repairing it, which was impossible in 11 minutes, but by deliberately rupturing the secondary housings in a precise sequence that would bleed the thermal load sideways into the dead galleries, the abandoned lower yards that no living thing occupied, sacrificing the empty stone to spare the occupied stone. It was the kind of solution that only made sense to someone who had spent a life choosing which depot to save when there was not enough to save them all. On the gantry above, Dral Corin felt it first. He felt the human's heartbeat in the deep gallery, still impossibly calm, and beneath it, he felt the basalt beginning to scream, the convergence surge loading into the cables, and he understood with the certainty of his vibration sense that the entire yard was about to die. He said one word. The cadre moved, but there was nowhere to move to. No evacuation that could outrun a thermal cascade, and Sub-Marshal Breeze Auger, tracking the surge as mathematics, returned a survival probability that rounded to 0. They were going to die on the gantry because the warden prefect had armed a bomb to kill one hostage. And then, in the deep gallery, the human finished her work, and the cascade that should have climbed all 9 cables bled sideways instead, venting into the dead galleries with a roar that shook the entire fortress city, the thermal load discharging into empty stone, the occupied yard shuddering but holding, the cables groaning back down into safe tension one by one. The survival probability in Breeze Auger, which had read 0, climbed in the space of 4 seconds back to certainty, and the auger could not explain why, because the auger could only measure what was, and what had just happened was something only one mind in the entire fortress city had been able to see coming and prevent. Sarai Voss climbed out of the deep gallery on her own, covered in the gray dust of ruptured housings. Her hands burned where she had worked the hot manifold without proper gloves, and she did not look triumphant, and she did not look afraid. She looked like someone who had finished a difficult job. The Talon cadre stood on the gantry and watched her come up out of the dark, and not one of them spoke, because the thing they were looking at had just refused to die in the manner they had been ordered to witness, and had in the same motion saved all 6 of their lives, and there was no field on any form for that. Isin Vael, the silent one, the watcher, was the first to move. Isin crossed the gantry and stood in front of the human, and after a long moment, in a voice the rest of the cadre had heard perhaps a dozen times in 8 years, Isin asked the human a single question, which was not who are you or how did you do that, but the only question that mattered to a creature whose entire life was observation. Isin asked the human what she had seen that nobody else had. And Sarai Voss, in the same mild tone she had used all week, told her. She told her about the coolant. She told her about the discrepancy in the southern tether yard, the surplus that had never been surplus, the relief system stripped of the coolant it needed to function, and she told her, without accusation, without emphasis, simply as a fact among facts, that someone had been selling that coolant for years, and that the selling was the reason the deep gallery had nearly killed them all. The cadre understood, all 6 at once, what they had just been ordered to do. They had been ordered to deliver a witness to her death, and the death had been engineered by the man whose theft she had uncovered, and they had very nearly been collateral. Breeze Auger logged the faces of her own cadre and read in them the same vectors she felt in herself, a unit that had spent 11 centuries serving the system as its instrument, arriving, all at once, at the understanding that the system had been prepared to spend them as casually as it spent everything else. Corin Daff, the youngest, the believer, the one who had carried the splinter of the repaired seal for a week, was the one who said it aloud. Because the young are the last to learn cynicism and the first to feel betrayal. He said that the warden prefect had tried to kill them. Nobody contradicted him, and in the silence that followed, the cadre stopped being the system's instrument and became, for the first time in any of their lives, 6 people who had decided something for themselves. What followed was not a battle, because the human did not believe in battles, having watched too many of them lost over logistics. What followed was an audit. Sarai Voss, with the Talon cadre standing behind her, not as guards now, but as something the Concordat had no protocol for, walked the reconciled numbers of the tether yard up the administrative chain, the accurate figures the restructured yard had begun to generate, and she set them beside the public manifests. And the gap between them was the exact shape of Calith Vren's theft. 4 years of stolen coolant rendered visible the moment someone competent finally read the second page. She did not accuse him. She did not need to. She simply made the numbers reconcilable, and a reconcilable ledger in a system that had never reconciled anything was a weapon more total than any blade, because it could not be intimidated, could not be reassigned to a labor rotation, could not be sent down into a deep gallery to die. The numbers were just true, and their truth climbed the chain the way the thermal cascade had not, until it reached a tier of the Concordat high enough that even Vren's careful shells could not stop it. Warden Prefect Calith. Vren was relieved of his custody on a gray morning in the administrative tier, and the manner of his relief was the manner of the system itself. Affectless, procedural, a line item adjusted, an asset reclassified. The cadre was not present for it, and the human was not present for it. And that was correct, because the niche of the story did not belong to his punishment, but to what his punishment made possible. He was processed by the same machinery he had trusted to protect him, and the machinery, when finally pointed at one of its own, proved exactly as indifferent to him as it had always been to everyone else. He had built his safety on the certainty that nobody competent would ever read the books. He had personally arranged for the most competent reader in 11 centuries to be delivered into his fortress and handed a data slate. The system did not appreciate irony. The human, had anyone asked her, would not have called it irony either. She would have called it logistics. Sarai Voss was not freed, not in the formal sense, because the treaty still held and the paperwork still listed her as a strategic asset, and the Iron Concordat respected paperwork above all things. But her conditions changed in the way the Concordat's conditions always changed, quietly, procedurally, without ceremony. She was reclassified again, this time from labor rotation to a designation that had never before existed in the Fortress City's administrative schema, a designation that translated roughly from the Maluni as the one who reconciles. And she was given an office in the logistics tier and access to the books. All of them. The second pages included, and across the following months, she did to the entire Fortress City what she had done to the tether yard, finding the wounds and explaining the patterns and letting the truth of the numbers do the work that no army from her homeworld had ever managed to do. The Concordat did not understand that it had been conquered. The system only tracked the things it knew how to track, and there was no field on any form for a defeated polity's hostage, quietly restructuring the military logistics of the power that held her, until the day the restructuring was complete, and the fortress city of Drenexcept ran, for the first time in 11 centuries, on numbers that were actually true. The Talon cadre was reassigned to her detail permanently, at Sub-Marshal Bree's own request, a request she filed through proper channels in the affectless language of administration, in which the system approved without ever understanding what it was approving. Officially, they were her security. The auger in Bree's left eye, recalibrated now past any returning, had long since stopped reading the human as a threat coefficient and started reading her as the only fixed point in a fortress full of drift. Draal Korun no longer found her stillness unsettling. He found it on the long, quiet shifts in the logistics tier, the one heartbeat in the entire city he could rely on. Martha Gren, who had insisted the first save was luck, became, in the way of proud men who are finally beaten, her most exacting technical collaborator, the only one who could keep pace with her structural reasoning, and the only one whose grudging precision she trusted with the work. Isabel Thorne tended the burns on the human's hands until they healed, and afterward kept tending, in small, unrequested ways, the way the human herself tended things. And Corin Daff, the youngest, the believer whose belief had been broken and rebuilt around a different center, became something like her apprentice, learning to see the wrong pixel, learning that the largest weapon in any system was a number that was finally, simply true. There was a morning, months into the work, when the heat exchange unit she had repaired in her first week finally gave out for good, and the bitter root tea in the gallery flask went cold, and the conscripts and the cadre and the human all noticed it at once, the small warmth that had circulated among them since the beginning of everything, gone. Nobody filed a requisition. The system would have ignored it. Instead, Draal Korun, the tracker who could feel a heartbeat through stone, went down into the maintenance bay on his own time and found the unit and worked at it for an hour with the wrong tools and his blunt, heavy hands, and he repaired it, badly, imperfectly, in the manner of someone who had learned the grammar of unrequested care from watching a creature he had once been ordered to let die. He brought the warmed flask up to the logistics tier and set it on the corner of her desk and said nothing, and asked nothing, and walked away. Sarai Voss did not look up from the manifest she was reconciling, but after he had gone, she reached out, without ceremony, and wrapped both healed hands around the warm flask and held it, and the office was quiet, and the numbers on the slate were true. And for the first time in 11 centuries, the fortress city of Drenexcept held something in its accounts that it had never once known how to measure.